Okay, having spoken with first Patrick and now Elizabeth, we'll now hand over to our fourth speaker of the day, who is Peter Branney, who's going to be talking about open science in qualitative research, which I'm very interested to hear because a lot of discussions about open science tend to focus on the more quantitative types of research projects, and this is, I think, a very interesting issue to discuss. So Peter is a fellow of the British Psychological Society, the Higher Education Academy and the Royal Society of Arts, and has undertaken an awful lot of projects to improve experiences of healthcare through interventions. I mean, I can't do justice to biography, but basically, I've heard him speak before on open science at various events, such as the Riots Club, which Sam Westwood, who spoke yesterday, runs, and I know he'll give us a very interesting session today. So, Peter, thank you very much for joining us today. The floor is yours.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, James. I just want to say thanks for inviting me. Thanks for your work and the work of your organisation. It is a privilege to be here. It's a shame it's not in person. It's also a privilege, I think, to come after Elizabeth Bick. I've followed your work with fascination on Twitter for a while, and I think I suppose my first thing is, why should the audience be interested in this talk? And I imagine some of you may be qualitative researchers, so there's an obvious connection there. I imagine quite a few of you might be supporting researchers, research students, undergraduate students, postgraduate students, might be supporting them to engage in research. And some of you might just be generally interested. So hopefully I've got something here for you. I want to pick up on a point, the interesting point that Patrick made was about data should be valuable in its own right. And another thing that Elizabeth Bick pointed out, that there should be less focus on productivity. And I suppose what me and my colleagues are trying to do with this work here is we're trying to slow things down. We're trying to engage with individual researchers, but give them steps that they can take individually. And each of these steps will orientate them towards a wider kind of framework or set of resources that can help them do that. So I suppose particularly for those of you supporting researchers, this will hopefully give you things that you can help direct them to. I should highlight that what I'm presenting here is based on a paper that me and colleagues are writing. So here's just a bit of an outline of our various roles in this project, and two of them are meeting today for the final editing of this paper and the writing of the conclusion. And quite often when I'm asked about qualitative methods, is people say, oh, what are the bad examples? And this is the only one I know of. And you can see here, I've done a screenshot just to show how it looks in my reference manager. It came up that this was a publication that had been retracted. And you can see here a couple of bullet points about this work. And I suppose what the bullet point shows is there's a wider context of malpractice or poor practice, if you want to be generous with this research. And this was qualitative research where the research tells a story about a community, and I suppose what the research has done is used a range of features to de-anonymize that community so that they're anonymized. And obviously because it's a community, there's geographic features, there's a number of different aspects that you might think could help you identify them, so that that person's done that. And it appears that really that person has not just tried to anonymize this community, but fabricated it and made it up. I would say though that my work's not really with bad apples, that I'm kind of thinking more about individual researchers and how they relate to the wider system and their frustrations with engaging with that system. So if you're looking at some of these steps, some of these frustrations may be to the hierarchy with the people in which they work with, and the kind of the way in which they use power to take power away, take away potential rewards from people. And I think some of it is also about the publication model and the kind of process where we conduct very kind of comprehensive, methodical, timely work, and we don't publish it until the end. And it's at the end that we get the peer review. And the frustration with that, the frustration on the word limit, and our inability to share the details of the methodology, the things we've done, for example, to de-identify or anonymize our work and protect privacy. Yeah, so I suppose you could think of it in terms of, this is about capability building, a little bit about motivation, and I suppose by making things seem easy to some people, giving them easy steps, we're hopefully building their motivation. That I'm using the term steps because it's something Emma Norris has talked about in relation to open science, and thinking about it being one step at a time, or engaging with it one step at a time. Because I think when you do start engaging with this, it can be a bit overwhelming, seeing the amount of things going on. And for an individual researcher, it's kind of, where do I start? And it's almost like, start anywhere, just do one thing at a time. Also, I think the notion of step gives an idea of progressing through a study, and these steps hopefully kind of give you a sense of thinking of authorship at the beginning of a project, sharing your data before you collect data, and then sharing your data after you've collected it, for example. So the first step then is to think about using the notion of contributorship, so authorship. So authorship is a kind of a standard through which we identify the people involved in a piece of work. There is the Vancouver criteria, which is commonly used, commonly referred to. So you can see here it's got 4 criteria, and I suppose it's point of all of them, they end with and. So you're not just involved in one of those criteria, you've got to be involved in all of them. And actually, I would point out from the Vancouver criteria, there's 2 additions, which I think makes me chuckle. I wonder how many authors would it, particularly for large scale projects, be able to recall all the different people and the range of roles. There's a big element of trust here, that these people, the authors should have a level of trust or confidence in the integrity. I think probably key things to point out then is that an author is involved in writing the publication. So not only just doing the research, they've got to be involved. And if somebody just did the research but weren't involved in writing the publication, weren't given the opportunity, they wouldn't meet these criteria. I think as well, the criteria 4, the accountable for all aspects. There's something there about responsibilities centralized into a small group of people, that those authors have to be accountable for it, even if much of the work falls outside their expertise. So contributorship is a notion that stands in contrast to this, so that it's a process of disclosing all who contributed to the research, to the planning, conducting and communicating about it. And the idea here is that you think about a contributor's role. What did they do? Describing that role, briefly explaining it, and then they're accountable for their role, not necessarily accountable for everything that was involved in it. And if you think about, well, how can you do that? So the credit taxonomy is one way in which you can do that as a process. So what I've done is just pulled out 3 of the roles and the definitions that are provided as part of the credit taxonomy. There's a link there to the website, so it's very easy. There's a reference resource for people to go back and check. You can see here, for example, there might be people who are involved in just reviewing and editing, not necessarily writing the manuscript draft. And I've used this recently. So Holcomb and colleagues have created what I'd call a web app that can help you do this. I've taken screenshots so you can access and download an Excel file or a table that lists people's names. You can put their roles. You can then upload that to here, and then you can get output in various formats. So some of these, I must admit, I don't know what this is, or the XML file, but presumably that's something that could be uploaded and reused, say, for manuscript submission. So I've pulled out a couple of examples from papers here. So a paper by a colleague called Laura Kilby, and has used the credit system. So this appears, I think, at the end of the article, but before the references. You can see here it's nice and simple in terms of just an outline of what they do. I suppose here the credit system is very much high level roles. I suppose it's a little bit like the credits after a film or broadcast television. And I suppose by being high level, it gives a level of, I suppose, easy to communicate to a range of audiences about that, about what's involved. It can also then be used in kind of researcher reward and recognition systems, so that, say, when submitting them to a manuscript submission system, some manuscripts, some journals now have integrated so that you can add your authors and you can click the boxes to their contribution. And it's also been built into ORCID as I suppose a researcher identification system. I think the idea there, but when it's used as normal practice, it's not just seeing what somebody's published, but you can see what their roles were. So if you're interested in a particular form of data collection, you may be able to identify people who've got experience in that form of data collection in a range of research using things like ORCID or database searches. Here's another one that's a bit longer, and I think it's quite a good example for, I suppose, a multi-author project where you get more people involved. And just so, again, simple. So it's here, they've got the names of the people followed by the role, a bit of repetition. And so I know Maddie Pownall has recently submitted something that I think has got about 70 authors, and it was quite a lot of work, I think, to do this, and hopefully things will get a bit easier with this. Okay, so why should you be interested, or should researchers be interested in doing this? So qualitative research includes a diverse range of approaches, for data collection and analysis. It means that we actively contribute in a wide variety of ways, and I suppose we want to value those roles, the diversity of contributions, to give value to them. I think particularly you might think of kind of non-academic contributors. So if you've got patients, research unit users, citizens, scientists involved in your work who wouldn't necessarily be involved in writing the publication, that credit or contributorships gives a role, a process for discussing their contribution, for explaining it, for tracking it and monitoring it, and then reporting it when it comes to manuscript submission. In lots of qualitative research, we're not so interested in bias as in describing and reflecting on the researcher's role. So contributorship hopefully feeds into that, as giving people a shared way of, a shared, I suppose, springboard into discussing researchers' role into, but also I think in reflecting on the wider discipline and the way in which the discipline makes possible or limits different ways of research. Certainly within authorship, there's a range of research that reports, I suppose, the barriers that early career researchers face to being named as researchers. In the UK, for example, if they're on temporary contracts, it's quite common that that the research writing, the report writing and manuscript submission happens after their contract has ended or that they've moved on. I think there's concerns about any people who've had to have time away because of disability, illness, even extended leave, or moving out of academia. It's kind of lack of recognition of their role in research through the Vancouver system. So hopefully the credit system is one way of engaging with that. So that's the first step. So then the second step is, once you've agreed to, well, even if you've not agreed to use contributorship, is to think about pre-registering or registering your method. So this, I think, is your method, everything that you'd include in your method, your research questions, as well as your analysis, your data collection, data gathering. So if you think about what is this is what you might think of the standard, very simplified timeline to producing research. You develop your idea, you design your study, collect your data, you write a report, you publish a report. And the classic is that you submit to a peer review journal and it gets published. And I know I'm sure many colleagues have this in many different disciplines, is that the submitting to a peer review journal can take years in terms of submitting, waiting for peer review, sometimes often getting inappropriate peer reviewers who lack expertise and ask questions that are irrelevant. I've had a journal, an article published, and I think it went to 20 different journals, and I think 2 of them sent it out for peer review. Obviously the final one sent it out for peer review. And I think there's a big frustration, I suppose, with qualitative methods, particularly in psychology, in a discipline that's largely experimental and quantitative, that there's insufficient expertise when it comes to peer reviewers. So this reliance on trying to get something published after you've done all the research is really frustrating, really timely. I think as well, the nature of this, the publication happening near the end, is the researcher reward and recognition is focused on the final output and not on all the work that goes into it. So there's, I think, a pressure to produce numerous publications rather than to do really good quality research. And I think that links in nicely with what Patrick Vallant and Elizabeth Bick were saying. So pre-registration is very simply to share or pre-register your design publicly before you collect or gather your data. Often talked about, I suppose, like a time-stamped sharing. Wikipedia, I think, is a good idea of the technology, in which the technology provides a record of when things were uploaded, who did the uploading, and then also, I suppose, the editing, and then when things were edited. I suppose this is kind of what you might think of as as a one-off sharing, but these systems are changing so that you can go back and show changes have been made and add a commentary on why those changes have been made. And I forgot what this is called now, but registered reports is a kind of another level of this, so that you submit this work for your design for peer review, and a journal or a peer review system might review it and then accept it. So the benefit there is that you've got in principle acceptance of your publication or your research before you even go out and collect or gather your data. And then when you come to the final report, there's a second process of peer review. And I suppose there the peer review ideally should be focused on how you have achieved your commitments in the study design, and potentially any justifications or any explanations for why things changed. And there are some, so I suppose this is at least in psychology, is much more common now for experimental research, but there are journals that are taking qualitative method studies. So I could think of BMJ, Open Science, F1000R Research. Even there's a journal called Cognition, which publishes qualitative research and has and accept registered reports. I think probably one of the risks with registered reports is they're still limited by the word limit or the page limit of the article, whereas pre-registering your report is potentially a separate publication. The downside to that, I suppose, is the tracking and the changes, being transparent about the changes that happen between the study design and the writing of the report. So how do you do this? How do you do it? I suppose it's almost like, what information would you want to have in a pre-registered report for qualitative data? And I suppose being aware that because there's a range of methods, but you also want to communicate to a range of audiences. So Tamarind and Haven and colleagues have done a Delphi study where they've gone through 3 rounds to come up with what you might call of as a collective norm about the headings as well as the descriptions for the information that should be in a qualitative study design. And of course, this was one study, and there are a range of quantitative or experimental or exploratory templates. But obviously in the future, we could have a range of templates for qualitative methods. So here is the pre-registration of this Delphi study. So you can see here, actually, there's a range of components, but what's probably notable, the key point here is that despite there being this kind of template system for uploading things, they had to add most details as a supplementary file. And this at the time was what was called an open-ended registration. And of course, the point of this Delphi study was to improve this. So you can see here that this is a study that Tamarind Haven has been involved in. You can have a look at this and see there's more details, but you can see that the registration type is qualitative registration. I think a big issue for me there is that there's less focus on hypothesis testing, and there's more scope for a description of the researcher or the researchers and potentially their role in the research. So I have had the privilege as well to be one of the peer reviewers of a stage 1 registered report for a longitudinal qualitative study. And I won't be surprised if this is probably the first stage 1 registered report for qualitative study. It's probably notable that the underpinning research was funded, had external funding, external from the university. So there was, they have to meet a timeline. And I don't know if we quite met that as peer reviews. There's 2 rounds of reviews, but it does mean at least that when they come to publish this, they have an in principle acceptance for this work. So why should you be interested in pre-registering your work? Hopefully, this is a process that facilitates and maximizes transparency, trustworthiness, rigor, and reflexivity. So it's not so much about hypothesis testing, it's not about prediction and post-diction, it's more about that facilitation, the publication model and the limited word limit prevents that, and it presents the final output as something fixed. And hopefully pre-registration can allow researchers to kind of build trust in their qualitative work, as well as to open it up and show more about the process about it. And I imagine that will be really helpful for the research methods training for qualitative methods, because often the method sections for qualitative research just have insufficient detail of what's gone on, very little detail about the role of the researcher in that, so that hopefully there'll be more scope for that with pre-registered studies. So the third step, sharing and securing your data. So what I want to do is give an example. I just want to, I suppose, warn you about this. So the example is from I want to show what data might be, qualitative data might be. I'm going to bring an example that shows a man, and it is related to a topic, a rare and very sensitive cancer. I'm just going to warn you about that, although there's not much details about this. So you can see here, there's 3 screenshots from a website from Health Talk Online. So this was some research I was involved in when we went out and interviewed men about a cancer they had, about their experience of it, their early signs and symptoms, the kind of seeking treatment, their experience of treatment, of recovery, aspects, I suppose, of their identity. And you can see here that this information was put on a website, and we negotiated consent with the participants. So in some cases, you can see here with Jim consented for video clips of him. So video clips, the audio and the text to be used. You can see here that interviewer 21, so this interview agreed to their name being interviewer 21. They agreed to the audio being shared, but not the video and the text. And whereas Tim agreed to his name being used, but not the audio or the video or the text. So if you remember, I think this was about 24 interviews, probably about 25 hours of interviews, as well as all the text, just to then just give you a list of most of the data that involved in this. So there's the video file, the audio file. We then paid a professional transcriber to turn that into a text version of the interview. The researchers then looked at that to edit it, so listened to the interview and just edited it to make sure it was as accurate as it could be. We then sent that transcript to the participant, and we asked them to sign a form and approve it. And we also gave them the opportunity to edit that. So you can see there that maybe that they may have changed it from what was said. So that, for example, the transcript showed a lot of repetition because they were trying to be a relatively accurate representation of what was said. And one participant took out all the repetition. So then I suppose you could say that within that, there's some of the data is their edits, but for at least there's the final interview transcript. There's also a biography of each participant that was written by the researcher. Again, we asked the participants to look at that and approve it, and they could change that. And then in terms of what went on the website, there was a draft theme, with quotes. We sent them out. So each theme went to 2 different external advisory members, one from academia, one from clinical practice or from the charitable sector. And so we had their feedback on each of those. And then, of course, there's the final version. That's just, I suppose, to open up. Now, if you look at any of the publications of this research, you might not realise that there was all those levels of data. So let's move on to, so what is open data? I've got here a definition, and I think you'll see, looking at this, that this is very much about being free access. So I suppose that kind of means people can find it, that they can use it, they can modify it, and they can share it for any purpose. So that's the strongest definition of open data. Now, you might think that qualitative research gets an open out, get out of jail card, that you kind of think, well, there's legitimate sensitivities to this data, and it's not just that it's identifying information, or even that it's sensitive information. There's also, I think, that even when we've gone through to de-identify or anonymize aspects of a transcript, or even you could go through a video to take out their face and take out phrases that are identifying, that there's also, I suppose, the level of detail of a 1-hour interview with somebody is that they can be identifying through the indistinct collection of details. So that, somebody close to one of these men being interviewed may be able to identify them, even though we've not mentioned the name of the hospital or where he lives or the names of his family members. It's just a collection of details. And I think there's also, potential in the future, say, for if there's an audio file but no video, it may be that future technology allows, reliable search for audio to identify people, so that even though that person's agreed to that it might mean that there's the possibility to aggregate across sources, so that that might not meet with the commitment, or participants might not be comfortable with that. So I would say that a lot of work now in the kind of guidance and policies on open data does recognise legitimate sensitivities. You can see here, so this is the UK Concordat on open research data, and clearly not all data can be open. Thoughts, which I suppose is an international network of people for framework of open research. I've forgotten what one of the R's is, reproducible teaching. And you can see here that they've added that sensitive or time-sensitive data sets can be embargoed or shared with more selective access. So open data does, I suppose, open data policies are recognising and trying to incorporate legitimate sensitivities. So this, I suppose, is just an outline. Okay, just let's think about what personal data is. So it's identifying data, tells you who you are. It might be sensitive data. So for example, in the UK, that legally, that's things like race, ethnicity, religion, sexuality. There's the innocent collection of details. I think there's also something here about research competency in, do they have the skills to de-identify or anonymize data sets? But there's also, I think, the worry that by sharing so much data, that we may reveal our failures, our mistakes, and particularly, I suppose, for researchers in vulnerable positions, Elizabeth Spitt, without the wider kind of financial support of a university. And there's also, I think we all work with limited resources, and whether the funding, there's the time, the PhD program, whether there is the resources or the time that it takes to de-identify something, as well as the time it takes to prepare data in such a way that you can, press the share button. So again, actually, I think probably the BPS, which I was involved in helping craft this, the British Psychological Society position statement on open data. They have two principles within that, and that's that that as open as possible, as closed as necessary. So I think is a really good principle about balancing, I suppose, openness with protection, as well as kind of highlighting that decisions made about data sharing need to be both justified and justifiable. I suppose it's justified in that you've made a case for it. Justifiable is the idea that other people may judge that case. And I suppose it might mean I suppose I worry about the idea of precedence, that because somebody else has shared the data on this topic, that means all future data sets on that should be shared. And that, I think the decision needs to be justifiable within the context of that research. So considering precedents, but also considering the resources, the research competence, the time available, and the institutional support. FAIR is another set of principles that's a bit more detailed. Again, about, is it findable? So I suppose I should talk a bit more about how, because I think this is very much where I look at these principles and think, I'm not sure I could do this. It's far too technical for me. And I think this is where using a data repository will really help, a library, for want of a better word, that will have that understanding and systems, so that if you use a repository, they can make it findable, and they can, I suppose, be responsible for the long-term findability. Can people search for it on the internet or a database? Making sure it's accessible so that a wide range of people can actually access it. Interoperable. I think this is a mixture of making sure that the language is relatively easy to use, description of methods, methodology, the data collection, as well as, I suppose, some of it is naming conventions around files, so that those files are machine readable, and it's reusable. I think this is about, I suppose, having a license and being clear about, can people reuse it, even if you want to protect it. If it's protected, you should be clear that it's not. And actually, FAIR does use this term metadata. And I think that's to highlight that the underpinning data may not be available, or it may be controlled or protected, but it's important to share the metadata, so the description of the research methods, the data collection procedures, as well as information on how you could access it. We have time, so I'm going to step ahead. So quickly, I think a way to think about this is when you come in to share your data is to think about the levels of processing and the levels of access, and then putting that in an archive. So what I've done here is I've taken these example data files from this example study, looking at the level of processing. So the lower the level, the less processing has been happened. And with this framework, the more identifiable it is. So part of processing is removing identifiable information. You can see here that the video file and the audio file are, from my point of view as a researcher, they're not processed, they are identifiable. The transcripts, it has some level of processing, although it doesn't necessarily mean it's been anonymized. And then level of access can be linked to this, so that you might choose to put this in a public archive and have it controlled. Other people might think that's unacceptable and it should be completely closed off. You might have a long-term embargo where you kind of think about archaeologists in the next 100 years and thinking, oh, maybe you want them to be able to access it. And again, but underpinning that would be negotiating consent with participants. And I would, in terms of a lot of experimental research, you're either in or out. Whereas I think when you've got this range of data, with my work, we have kind of a stepwise and negotiated consent, so that participants can consent to just the text being shared. They could share consent to the audio and consent to the video. And I suppose within that, there's the option to have their data withdrawn. And then I suppose thinking about an archive, at least in the future, that would make that possible. So the UK Data Service is one archive that's got a long history of engaging with qualitative methods. I know goes back to previous organisations in at least the 1980s, and I know I've been at a seminar where somebody else was aware of its history beyond that. And here's an example. You can see its title, you can see the researchers, you can see the data lists. There's a description of the nature of the data, and within that, this is safeguarded and how you can access it. So I was able to go in to access this data. So I had to add a project to kind of say it's part of a project. And then when I had a project, I was able to download. I should add, so I'm part of a UK higher education institution. So as part of that, I have a login, I'm identified. I imagine, for example, Elizabeth Bick might not be able to do this. So why should you share your data? So in the UK particularly, it is becoming a requirement. So at the very least, there's an expectation from NIHR, for example, that when you're applying for research, that you'll have a plan to share your data. Although I suppose there's also expectation that at least there's a data sharing statement, and that statement may include that data is not available. I think there's a value issue here, that it's about slowing things down, recognizing just the time, effort and skill in data collection, as well as opening up the process and, for example, my list of all the different data files. There's also responsibility, I think, as qualitative researchers, we have both productive and limited responsibility. So productive to get the most out of our data, to get the most out of participants, very valuable time, as well as limiting of kind of responsibility to protect that data. And in some senses, an archive might have that skill and competency in how to protect a digital asset. So that's it from me. Thank you very much for taking your time to listen. Hopefully there's a few minutes for questions.
That was fascinating. Thank you so much, Peter. It was really interesting. We've had an awful lot of questions and discussion in the chat during the Q&A stream. So we've got a few minutes, so I will a few, and my apologies to those we don't get a chance to deal with, but it was a fascinating talk. And if people ask, we're making the slides available on our website as soon as possible, and the recording as well. That will take a little bit longer. Okay, so we've had a few questions about, and I'm going to pull out some themes in the questions about the applicability of the themes and practices you're talking about to qualitative research across all disciplines. Catherine notes, for example, that some disciplines have embraced things like pre-registration, say psychology and economics. Others seems more resistant or hesitant. And other questions about, for example, Philip says, in qualitative research, you often don't know what the questions are. It's more about, well, what are the issues? What are we looking into? So does this sort of potentially what we see as kind of a linear methodology work for qualitative research in general and for all disciplines of it?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely, I think there's a context in which these practices have been developed largely by people from experimental backgrounds doing hypothesis testing. Are you still there, James? You've frozen.
Yes, I am here.
Yeah. So I think there is a context that, and I would say though that I challenge that researchers are reluctant. I think often the researchers are within a context within which they're expected to produce a lot. They've not got the time to focus on quality and the rigor in their research. I mean, my colleagues and I, we've picked up these 3 steps because we think they are applicable across a wide range, and we think that with all 3 of them, there's something external to draw upon to help people do that. So certainly, credit is a relatively easy, I think, quite intuitive, process to go through. So I suppose, and I suppose though I'm biased because I've spent the time engaging with that. I can emphasize with people who look at it and think, oh my God, I don't have time for this.
Thank you. Okay, Nicole asks, how is pre-registering the design different from ethical approvals, which she feels is in itself a kind of effective peer review process?
Yeah, no, I think that's brilliant, actually. I mean, my experience at ethical reviews, they're either institutional level or NHS level, and that they are not public documents. So I think that's probably the public sharing of it is really important. I also think as well, I think in ethical review, I think the bias is towards ethical review, not scientific review. And I think that's an important difference. So that, certainly there's, we can say that we've had ethical review, but I think peer reviews can still say, I think you should change your research questions. Sure. As if you say, I've shared my research questions, I've shared how they changed at these different points, then there's a kind of it makes it difficult or easy to challenge any suggestions to change that.
Thank you, that's really helpful. I think tally what I know a lot of ethicists say, which is their focus is on the ethical issues, and it's not quite the same as peer review. Question or comment that came from Gavin in the chat earlier. Since the focus of qualitative research is the subject of subjective material of experience, is it overkill to imply research integrity measures designed to facilitate reproducibility in quantitative fields? And goes on to say, should you expect qualitative research to be reproducible in the same sense?
Yeah, I mean, it's not about making it reproducible. I think it's much more about, it's in relation to the subjectivity of the research, being able to share that rather than trying to present it as a fixed thing at the end of the research. I think some of the templates for quantitative research, if you look at them, I suppose more for mixed methods, qualitative, quantitative, they might be overkill. I wonder if, in some senses, the peer-reviewed publication at the end is overkill, and it's more about slowing things down and having lots of little things that are kind of low stakes sharing of the research along the way, rather than high stakes sharing of the research at the end.
That's really helpful. Thank you so much. Okay, we've had loads of interesting questions in loads of interesting comments in the chat stream, which I think are definitely worth looking into. And as I said earlier, the issues we haven't been able to answer questions or comments raised in the chat stream, we'll explore with the speakers how we can respond to these issues in other ways. So expect some updates from that shortly. Oh, I should also note both yesterday and today we were asked if we would publish the chat stream. Now we've also had a few people say to us following those questions, gosh, if this is going to be published, I perhaps might want my comments removed or toned down somewhat. Now, we don't normally publish the chat streams, so there are issues of anonymization, issues of consent here and the like, though this is an open meeting which anyone can access. So we'll look into how we can kind of capture and disseminate key points from the chat, and if we can do so in a way that is ethical and consensual and the like. So we'll have a think about that internally, and then make some decisions and contact people if necessary. We don't normally do it, but we will explore whether we can do it because the chat streams have been really useful. We'd certainly like to capture the key points in them if possible. So we'll come back to you on that. But Peter, thank you so much for your comments today. It's a really interesting aspect of qualitative research, how we can sort of capture these things. And also I think it's important to have the conversation, as I said to you in the sort of pre-conference briefing the other day, so often the discussion about open research relate very much to the more it's very heavily STEM focused in certain disciplines within the STEM reason. I think it's very important that other disciplines and the broader discipline spectrum as a whole considers these issues and the applicability of open research to their own particular research tradition. So thank you so much for joining us today. We'd certainly like to have further conversation with you about this.
Thank you.